Hi, this is Greg Kilstrom. Welcome to the Agile World podcast, where we discuss customer experience, employee experience, and transformation in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by Tech Systems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to techsystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, a blueprint for creating an experience-led organization, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kilstrom, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of CareerGig and host of the Agile World podcast. Today, we're going to talk about agility in teams and how productivity, psychological safety, and an agile approach work together for the benefit of organizations and those who work within them. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Duena Blomstrom, an accomplished author and co-founder and CEO of PeopleNotTech. PeopleNotTech offers a revolutionary machine learning-powered software solution in the form of a work tool that checks and improves psychological safety in teams. First, why don't you tell me a little bit about your background and what led you to start PeopleNotTech?
First and foremost, thank you so much for having me, Greg. And These are topics that are tough but necessary at this point. So the more we talk about them, the better. Sometimes I hear myself say the same thing over and over again. I wish there were other ways to put them, but this is the time to be a broken record, I'm afraid. So my journey so far is very long, but I would attempt to keep it short for the sake of anyone listening.
Sure.
I come from a background of psychology and business, ended up in fintech for my sins one way or another a few years ago, at the beginning of fintech, really, many years ago. And in that capacity, I fell in love with Agile while making innovative products for fintech and while talking to all the banks in the universe. And it became a fetish more than anything else. Today my bills are in a Trello board. My vacation plans are in a Trello board. You name it. I run my life. If all Post-its and Trello boards in the world would disappear, my life would not be able to be run anymore. And so that was from an agile perspective. And right after that, if you wish, I also became really entranced with a big gap between what technology allows us to do and what agile powers in terms of fast technology, and how little of that really translates to the consumer. And in the banking industry, that was a really big gap. So I left the successful fintech I was with at the time and started, I probably in retrospect going through a midlife crisis, and started to decide that I'm going to change the universe. I'm going to go talk to all these banks, tell them what they've done wrong, where they have to focus on the consumer, and they will magically become agile, design-driven, and care about their customers. This was a few years ago, and obviously, just by the tone I have on this, it did not work out quite like that. In fact, a few months into it, I became really annoyed, if I'm honest, with the pace in which nothing was happening. I was talking to all these boards. I was telling them essentially that they need to do better by their consumer. They have huge debt that's technological, but also huge debt that's human debt with their employees. They nodded fervently. I went home, they went home, nothing happened. So a few months into it, I just couldn't do it anymore. So I put everything I was telling them for 20K into a book for 20 quid. And said, you know what, read this. If nothing else, just read this. And it's what I would have told you anyways in person. It's about how to change your culture and how to be agile and how to care about your consumers. And while I was doing the book, it occurred to me, and finally bringing us to present day to a degree, it occurred to me that this human debt that I've honed in, which is essentially, to my mind, the equivalent of the technical debt, but at an employee level. So all the things we've missed on doing for our human beings at work, all the respect we haven't given them, all the care we haven't shown, all of that human debt exists not only at bank level, but at every other organization level. So my next crusade became, how do we change all the other organizations that have human debt? And what are the things that would be pivotal in making that type of a change inside an organization? That is what brings us to present day. And about a year and a half ago, I started this startup of ours, which is now a scale up, I suppose. It took us by wind, called PeopleNotTech, and which is, we recognize an irony we have to defend every day because we make a software solution for teams. But the solution we're making, despite many other iterations and many pivots and many tries and many tests, is now focused solely on, as you said, psychological safety and increasing that as a lever for performance, in particular in agile teams.
Well, yeah, it sounds like we have quite a bit in common here. So, a love of Agile, dare I say, I've got some background in financial services as well, and just, the writing books, entrepreneurship. So looking forward to talking about this stuff in more depth. So let's start with your company, PeopleNotTech, and its approach to teams and productivity. PeopleNotTech specializes in identifying psychological safety factors and using some interesting technologies to do so. For everybody listening, can you define psychological safety a little more and explain why it's important?
Yes, of course. Psychological safety is essentially the concept through which, within a team, you feel free to take interpersonal risks, meaning you are never stopped from expressing yourself by a fear of something or other. So it's essentially that team dynamic and that team behavior where people speak up, they offer their opinion, they are authentic, they are open, they contribute, they're collaborative, all the good things we want in an enterprise. And the opposite of it, or the dark side of it, if you wish, are the negative behaviors in which people stop themselves from doing that, meaning there's a specific term with that called impression management. So when you impression manage in a team, is that when you stop yourself from saying anything for fear of looking incompetent, for fear of looking ignorant, looking negative, intrusive, or disruptive. So if you're afraid of those, of appearing that way to your peers and you perceive that as a risk, then that's when you don't speak up, and that's when that entire team doesn't have psychological safety. The reason why this psychological safety is a big deal is that it is essentially the number one determiner of teams that are being high performant or not. And the history of the term is actually really, really interesting, because when we found it, and it's, as I said, only a year and a half or 2 years ago, we're relatively new to the topic, we found it like everyone else did, meaning there was there was quite a body of research from an academical perspective. It had been studied in the 60s. There have been, then the biggest body of research comes from Professor Dr. Amy Edmondson, who is a very dear friend of ours now, we're proud to say. And she had studied it for many, many years in various different settings and industries, in particular with an eye towards healthcare and an eye towards aviation. And her studies were showing the same thing over and over again. The teams that do have psychological safety, that feel safe to take risks with each other, are winning, and the ones that aren't are not. Except the industry, if you wish, hadn't, or rather the business world hadn't really taken notice, in my opinion, until Google ran a very, very extensive study during 4 years, I think 180 teams or so. And what they wanted to find out in that study was what makes Google's teams successful, what makes them high performant. And they had a bevy of factors they considered. They had all the types of data you can imagine, from what they are being paid, from their existing skills, from keywords to gender to you name it. So they tested all the variables you can think of. And the one thing that came back over and over again was a list of 5 predetermining factors that all of the performant teams had in common, and they all started with psychological safety. So as soon as they put that out, it became more of a familiar term, and the industry started taking notice. And I think, from the point of view of your listeners, the most interesting bit of it has been a year ago, when the DORA State of DevOps report came out, and every diagram started with a box saying a culture of psychological safety. You want testing, you need a culture of psychological safety. You want your CI/CD play to actually work out, you need a culture of psychological safety. So you name it, whatever you wanted to accomplish, if you were in the knowledge industry, in particular if you were making software, you had to start with that. And I think very important to this audience is, I presume anyone listening to you would have read and should have read really the projects, as I call them. So if you look at Project Phoenix, I'm sure you have seen it, and then Project Unicorn from Jim Kim, they both refer to the topic, in particular Project Unicorn, and they reframe the idea of psychological safety if we want to have successful agile.
Well, so you touched on this a little bit already, but from a results standpoint, I mean, someone that is comparing investing in some other behavioral tools, like what's the biggest differentiator from the results that you would ideally get?
Right. If I'm honest, I haven't really seen behavioral tools that really look at the behavior of the employees, not in the sense that we refer to it. So, in other words, when we started, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big make things person. I'm a big let's put the platform together person, right? So I looked across the market and I did a good canvassing of what exists out there. And with the idea of I'll find what exists and it's worthwhile, I'll put it together and make sure that it's now more significant, and I can then go back to the business with it. And we couldn't find anything. And in fact, the only things we could find were the Spotify health check, which we were using anyways in our startup, which isn't this really, but it's touching on things closer than other things, a lot closer than annual survey or a 360, who don't even touch on these things really. And then the other thing that was really worthwhile was, of course, sorry about that, was, of course, Amy's actual list of questions. But they were so academic that not even our developers wanted to touch them. So I realized very quickly we have to find a way that they sound, the questions are right, although they should be a lot more than them, so that you have engagement that's continuous, because psychological safety is not something you have or you don't have once and for all. It's something that grows and changes depending on your sprint, depending on what you've been asked to do, depending on how many COVID crises you're traversing, and so on. So essentially, we wanted something that was easy to engage with, that was checking these bits, and that was giving a live result. And what we found was one that didn't exist. We had to rewrite all this. And then in the process of writing it, we realized we can't define something as a nebulous concept, right? So we all now know that psychological safety is important. We all instinctively remember a time when we were in a team and we were making magic with them. We want that. And how much do we miss it? But at the same time, we need to know what are the levers in there, what are the components that will make it or break it, right? So I'm personally autistic and I'm the product owner of this baby. So I had to go, right, how do we split this? What does it actually mean, right? It can't just mean trust. It can't just be a nebulous team dynamic. It has to mean some element of the dynamic in the team. And that is how after loads and loads of testing, we ended up with 6 different elements of psychological safety that will tell you if a team is doing well in general, psychological safety-wise. And those are flexibility, resilience. There are 2 different coordinates because resilience is being measured over time and it includes engagement. And then we have, of course, we measure engagement separately as well. It's a big component. But then we measure learning, or how curious they are and how willing they are to learn together. And we measure courage and speaking up. And once you start measuring those things separately and you put them together, you start seeing things you could be doing as a team to get better at them. So what we have today really is a space for a team to see this in very clear data and start putting in interventions in their people practice to increase the bits and pieces that will make them more performant.
Yeah. So I guess then to take that a step further, what does that look like? And you described the six factors and how it's measured and stuff. But if I'm on a team right now, and what are the things that I should be looking for? Are we doing okay, or do we need improvement still? Or like what does success look and feel like?
That's a really good question. So what we say all the time is, while we would like everyone in the talk to forever be on our software, that's probably a long way away. So what we would like to see meanwhile happening is give the market and the business world as much help as we can for them to do it manually, if you wish, right? Or for them to kind of attempt to address some of these bits and pieces. So the way we do it is a lot easier from a point of view of, if you want to do it seriously and involvedly, it's a lot easier for you as a team leader to do it this way than to do it on your own manually, as I said, because what we do is we give each team member a container to ask fun, engaging questions. We might give them a reward. So we find those things out without you as a team leader having to ask all those questions, which can be hundreds of questions before you really get data. Imagine if you try to do that one-on-one, but you can, but it's a lot more work. And then if you did get all those answers, you'd have to be able to interpret them against a score of psychological safety. And you'd have to be able to look at these elements separately and go, is my team flexible? What is changing their resilience? What can I do to make them more resilient over time? What can we all do together to increase our engagement? What kind of interventions or a human hackathon, I'll give you an example, or a team relaunch, or a set of things that would bring us together on these particular bits and pieces. So it is doable manually. There are screenshots of our software everywhere. People can just do these bits without our software.
Well, don't say that,
Look, obviously, I'm not horribly worried because there's enough algorithm in how we put together our data that we're not we don't feel in any kind of risk. But with that said, even if they did it at the point of understanding how important these bits are, and they cracked on their human practice, we'd be in a much better position than we are today in the enterprise. And the reason to do that, because you said it earlier, this is not, I say this over and over again almost every day, this is not a moral play. We shouldn't be doing this because it's nice to do or we owe it to our people. Both of those things are true. Obviously, it's nice. Obviously, we owe it. But let me tell you, it doesn't even matter if it is nice or moral or not. What matters is this is connected directly to the bottom line. And there are actually internal numbers. Sadly, they're not public, and for good reason, because people know that these are their secret sources. But there are exact numbers as to how connected this type of high performance and productivity that connects to psychological safety is to the bottom line. So most enterprises see 40-50% increase in productivity as soon as they start focusing on psychological safety.
I know you also have an upcoming book related to this topic. Is there anything else, any teasers or anything you want to share that you haven't already?
Okay, I'll give you guys something that I haven't told anybody else before. So this is
nice, exclusive.
Exclusive, yes. I had a chapter in the book. So, let me backtrack a little bit. So the book in itself is with Bloomsbury. It's coming out early next year. It's called The People Before Tech: The Importance of Psychological Safety and Teams in the Digital Age. So because, as you hear in the title, it's going through everything, the topic of digital, the VUCA topic, Agile. There's actually a really solid chapter on Agile, which I now fear horribly that it's a bit too popularized. Maybe I was trying to put together all these audiences, right? And then bring it all back to all that matters is the team, and all that matters is this umbrella concept that includes all the human debt eradication, right? So it's a difficult type of proposition book-wise, I accept, because being from trying to kind of bridge all these industries meant that I had to dumb down the Agile topic, dumb down some of the people topic, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing I would say is I have lifetime ambition to show that the real purpose of DevOps has always been, or Agile and I use them I replace them with each other, and people hate that, I know.
Yeah.
I have a reason to do so. I'm not going to bore you with that, but one point is, I think Agile was put on earth so that we then show how important it is to have happy, engaged, and functional, high-performant employees. That's my view. Now, to prove that, it would mean that I can then use Agile with its astounding KPIs that show you speed and ability and accuracy and whatever, and use those KPIs to prove psychological safety and therefore all of these good, nice concepts about humanity, right? So that was my hope, that we can use Agile to do that. So a large part of the book had been, not a large, 2 chapters had been structured around the idea of doing an experiment, meaning getting a couple of or a few enterprises in who are Agile shops from different industries, and testing in there within their organization, testing A/B testing a team that does have a people practice view with psychological safety at the center, and the team who doesn't, and just kind of measure them and observe them over a period of a few weeks or a few months. That was my experiment. It is now called the experiment of trying to experiment, is how little of those I could find. So that's your exclusive. I haven't been able to find the three different places that were willing and able to do that. You'll have to read to see why, but I think sadly the reasons are pretty clear to all of us listening.
Great. Well, no, I appreciate you giving us a sneak peek there, and also I think that's a perfect segue to the next topic that I wanted to get into was Agile, and I saw an article you recently wrote on for Forbes talking about how Agile, certainly started in certain silos and certain departments and divisions within organizations, but it's slowly making its way out of project management technology and working its way a little more broadly. How do you see that transition occur? Like, do you see that as very slow moving, or and how does it stack up against when management is doing things like Six Sigma, Lean, other kind of methodologies? Like, how do you see is the transition going well, in other words, or is there still a lot of work to be done and a lot of education to be done?
Gosh, that's 8 questions. But
sorry, yeah.
I can do it. Let me see. So
you can answer at least 2 of them. You don't have to answer all 8.
I will. So a couple of things. First of all, a correction for anyone wanting to following me. I no longer write for Forbes, and that's because they were too entrenched into their love of a certain point of view, and we didn't agree on it. So I have transitioned to writing for LinkedIn 3 times a week. Twice it's about psychological safety, and once on Wednesdays it's a newsletter about the future being agile. So people can subscribe over there, I suppose. But with that said, so I've been talking about agile and writing about agile for a good 3 years now, and I think of myself as an agile anthropologist, if you wish. So I'm looking at agile from all points of view, but above all as a mindset and as a way of thinking. So I always say you can't have the wow without the what. You can't have the new ways of work without the new ways of thinking. And I think from that perspective, the transition hasn't even really begun in most places, to finally answer your question. So you're going to have a number of enterprise that are, first of all, we have to make a very serious distinction between enterprises that are digitally native and have come about in the last few years. So they have been built with agile at the heart. And even there, it's not all roses and tea. It's sometimes difficult. But for the rest of us who have lived the vast majority of our professional lives in environments where the way of thinking was and is waterfall, the jump and the change to agile is humongous, and it is understated by it being shoved into a certain philosophy. And to backtrack again, you asked about how does it compare to Lean and Six Sigma and so on. I don't like the distinction. I call agile, if you wish, everything that's the opposite of a waterfall way of thinking. So anything that will allow you to split the work into smaller bits and then collaboratively grab at those bits in a way that you put your heart into, that's an agile way of work to me. And from that perspective, I can then get away with interchanging the terms tremendously. So it doesn't really matter if your agile means Scrum or Kanban. It doesn't really matter if your management is, you call it servant leadership, or you do Lean, or you do whatever else we're going to call it in the future. As long as you are keen on making things happen, have broken the work down in ways that can be interchangeable and can be collaborative, you're good and you're agile to me. So from that perspective, it is sipping down simply because people can see value fast. But we're not going to be able to see serious change until we make those changes at mentality level. And they are difficult to do because we all, as I said, went through education and then our formative years believing things have to be done one after the other, whereas this new way of thinking asks you to forget that and do them in a very different rhythm. and do them continuously and be comfortable with change and be easy with the fact that you're all doing them together and have no ego. So it implies very many things that we are not used with. So unless we change those, it won't matter what terminology we use, what school of thought we subscribe to, whether or not we plaster the manifesto on some walls or not. Realistically, we're not going to get there. And when we do get there, it will be at every level of society. I envision even education for our kids is going to change. Fast forward 100 years, waterfall would be a long forgotten mistake.
Well, where do you see the biggest opportunity for I guess, even just to make it more specific? So, within an organization, let's say in the technology practice, they're already agile, but, where do you see the biggest opportunity where, agile may not be already ingrained or things like that? With, where can someone start, in other words, at a company to really get things moving in that direction?
At the very top, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So your leadership teams that haven't had that change of heart and mentality are the bigger top. We have gotten, for whatever reason, about 5-6 years ago, in many industries, there was this circulating feeling of we'll wait this old guard out before we're going to see proper change in our enterprise. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. Number one, we can't wait anyone out. We can't afford that. Every enterprise that is today finds themselves in a waterfall frame of mind, irrespective of what they say to each other, is in danger of not existing in the next 2 to 3 years, in particular with how COVID and the recession are going to speed that up. And in particular, if their competition is digitally native, is agile at heart, is focused on their people. So anyone who thinks they can just wait and not change their very top is a dreamer, because realistically what we need is leadership teams who have a team, because you'd be shocked how uncommon that is. Leadership teams who have common purpose, who are psychologically safe, and leadership teams who are agile. Once we have those, we have a better chance. And then we'll meet somewhere in the middle, because the lower levels are smart and nimble enough. There is a very serious frozen middle, isn't that what we call it? And then we need to start working very seriously on our top.
Well, one last question before we wrap up. For those that want to learn more about psychological safety and its importance, where would you recommend they look for more information?
Right. So they should buy every book that Professor Dr. Amy Edmondson ever wrote. There are only 2 or 3 of them, 3 or 4 of them. I hope I'm not wrong. So absolutely need reading. They should read Gene Kim, of course. Obviously, they should. And they can also go, we have a resources page at psychologicalsafety.works/resources, where we've put all of our videos and a bunch of resources in there that people can find to read more about it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep in touch and keep up with what you're doing?
Thank you so much for having me. So psychologicalsafety.works is where the solution lives. PeopleNotTech.com is where they can find out more about us. But I am on LinkedIn, as I said. Please subscribe to the newsletters if you want to hear from me all the time. And then just kind of reach out. More than happy to talk to anyone. It's a tight, it's not a tight-knit community, but it's a tight circle of us that really get it and can move mountains. So happy to speak to anyone who believes that they would like to try that.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank Duena Blomstrom, co-founder and CEO of PeopleNotTech, for joining the show. To learn more about customer and employee experience, I recommend you go to my website at gregkillstrom.com and make sure to check out my latest book, The Center of Experience. More information is available on my website or wherever the book is available, like Amazon. Thanks for listening to The Agile World with Greg Killstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. I'm your host, Greg Killstrom. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, from my website at theagile.world or on Amazon or other retailers. Until next week, stay agile.